Chapter 14. The First Witnesses for Sunday. The first day of the week is now almost universally observed as the Christian Sabbath. The origin of this institution is still before us as the subject of inquiry. This is presented by two eminent church historians, but so directly do they contradict each other that it is a question of curious interest to determine which of them states the truth. Thus, Mosheim writes respecting the first century, quote, "All Christians were unanimous in setting apart the first day of the week, on which the triumphant Savior arose from the dead, for the solemn celebration of public worship. This pious custom, which was derived from the example of the Church of Jerusalem, was founded upon the express appointment of the apostles, who consecrated that day to the same sacred purpose, and was observed universally throughout the Christian churches, as appears from the united testimonies of the most credible writers." Close quote. Now let us read what Neander, the most distinguished of church historians, says of this apostolic authority for Sunday observance. Quote, "The festival of Sunday, like all other festivals, was always only a human ordinance, and it was far from the intentions of the apostles to establish a divine command in this respect, far from them, and from the early apostolic church, to transfer the laws of the Sabbath to Sunday. Perhaps at the end of the 2nd century a false application of this kind had begun to take place, for men appear by that time to have considered laboring on Sunday as a sin." Close quote. How shall we determine which of these historians is in the right? Neither of them lived in the apostolic age of the Church. Mosheim was a writer of the 18th century, and Neander of the 19th. Of necessity, therefore, they must learn the facts in the case from the writings of that period which have come down to us. These contain all the testimony which can have any claim to be admitted in deciding this case. These are, first, the inspired writings of the New Testament, second, the reputed productions of such writers of that age as are supposed to mention the first day, such as the Epistle of Barnabas, the letter of Pliny, governor of Bithynia, to the Emperor Trajan, and the Epistle of Ignatius. These are all the writings prior to the middle of the 2nd century, and this is late enough to amply cover the ground of Mosheim's statement, which can be introduced as even referring to the first day of the week. The questions to be decided by this testimony are these: did the apostles set apart Sunday for divine worship, as Mosheim affirms, or does the evidence in the case show that the festival of Sunday, like all other festivals, was always only a human ordinance, as is affirmed by Neander? It is certain that the New Testament contains no appointment of Sunday for the solemn celebration of public worship, and it is equally true that there is no example of the Church of Jerusalem on which to found such observance. The New Testament therefore furnishes no support for the statement of Mosheim. The three epistles which have come down to us purporting to have been written in the apostolic age, or immediately subsequent to that age, next come under examination. These are all that remain to us of a period more extended than that embraced in the statement of Mosheim. He speaks of the 1st century only, but we summon all the writers of that century and of the following one prior to the time of Justin Martyr, A.D. 140, who are even supposed to mention the first day of the week. Thus the reader is furnished with all the data in the case. The Epistle of Barnabas speaks as follows in behalf of the first day observance. Quote, "Lastly he saith unto them, Your new moons and your Sabbaths I cannot bear them. Consider what he means by it. The Sabbaths, says he, which you now keep are not acceptable unto me, but those which I have made. When resting from all things, I shall begin the 8th day, that is, the beginning of the other world, for which cause we observe the 8th day with gladness, in which Jesus arose from the dead, and having manifested himself to his disciples, ascended into heaven." Close quote. It might be reasonably concluded that Mosheim would place great reliance upon this testimony as coming from an apostle, and as being somewhat better suited to sustain the sacredness of Sunday than anything previously examined by us. Yet he frankly acknowledges that this epistle is spurious. Thus he says, quote, "The Epistle of Barnabas was the production of some Jew who most probably lived in this century, and whose mean abilities and superstitious attachment to Jewish fables show, notwithstanding the uprightness of his intentions, that he must have been a very different person from the true Barnabas, who was St. Paul's companion." Close quote. In another work, Mosheim says of this epistle, quote, "As to what is suggested by some, of its having been written by that Barnabas who was the friend and companion of St. Paul, the futility of such a notion is easily to be made apparent from the letter itself. Several of the opinions and interpretations of Scripture which it contains, having in them so little of either truth, dignity, or force, as to render it impossible that they could ever have proceeded from the pen of a man divinely instructed." Close quote. Neander speaks thus of this epistle, quote, "It is impossible that we should acknowledge this epistle to belong to that Barnabas who was worthy to be the companion of the apostolic labors of St. Paul." Close quote. Professor Stewart bears a similar testimony, quote, "That a man by the name of Barnabas wrote this epistle, I doubt not. That the chosen associate of Paul wrote it, I with many others must doubt." Close quote. Dr. Killen, professor of ecclesiastical history to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church of Ireland, uses the following language, quote, "The tract known as the Epistle of Barnabas was probably composed in AD 135. It is the production, apparently, of a convert from Judaism who took special pleasure in allegorical interpretation of Scripture." Close quote. Professor Hackett bears the following testimony, quote, "The letter still extant, which was known as that of Barnabas, even in the 2nd century, cannot be defended as genuine." Close quote. Mr. Milner speaks of the reputed Epistle of Barnabas as follows, quote, "It is a great injury to him to apprehend the epistle, which goes by his name, to be his." Close quote. Kitto speaks of this production as, quote, "the so-called Epistle of Barnabas, probably a forgery of the 2nd century." Close quote. Says the Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, speaking of the Barnabas of the New Testament, quote, "He could not be the author of a work so full of forced allegories, extravagant and unwarrantable explications of Scripture, together with stories concerning beasts and such like conceits as make up the first part of this epistle." Close quote. Eusebius, the earliest of church historians, places this epistle in the catalogue of spurious books. Thus he says, quote, "Among the spurious must be numbered both the books called the Acts of Paul and that called Pastor and the Revelation of Peter. Besides these, the books called the Epistle of Barnabas and what are called the Institutions of the Apostles." Close quote. Sir William Domville speaks as follows, quote, "But the epistle was not written by Barnabas. It was not merely unworthy of him, it would be a disgrace to him, and what is of much more consequence, it would be a disgrace to the Christian religion, as being the production of one of the authorized teachers of that religion in the times of the apostles, which circumstance would seriously damage the evidence of its divine origin. Not being the Epistle of Barnabas, the document is, as regards the Sabbath question, nothing more than the testimony of some unknown writer to the practice of Sunday observance by some Christians of some unknown community, at some uncertain period of the Christian era, with no sufficient ground for believing that period to have been the 1st century." Close quote. Coleman bears the following testimony, quote, the Epistle of Barnabas, bearing the honored name of the companion of Paul in his missionary labors, is evidently spurious. It abounds in fabulous narratives, mystic, allegorical interpretations of the Old Testament, and fanciful conceits, and is generally agreed by the learned to be of no authority." Close quote. As a specimen of the unreasonable and absurd things contained in this epistle, the following passage is quoted. Quote, "Neither shalt thou eat of the hyena," that is, again, be not an adulterer, nor a corrupter of others, neither be like to such. And wherefore so? Because that creature every year changes its kind, and is sometimes male and sometimes female." Close quote. Thus, first-day historians being allowed to decide the case, we are authorized to treat this epistle as a forgery. And whoever will read its 9th chapter, for it will not bear quoting, will acknowledge the justice of this conclusion. This epistle is the only writing purporting to come from the 1st century, except the New Testament, in which the first day is even referred to. That this furnishes no support for Sunday observance, even Mosheim acknowledges. The next document that claims our attention is the letter of Pliny, the Roman governor of Bithynia, to the Emperor Trajan. It was written about AD 104. He says of the Christians of his province, quote, "They affirmed that the whole of their guilt or error was that they met on a certain stated day, before it was light, and addressed themselves in a form of prayer to Christ as to some God, binding themselves by a solemn oath, not for the purposes of any wicked design, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to eat in common a harmless meal." Close quote. This epistle of Pliny certainly furnishes no support for Sunday observance. The case is presented in a candid manner by Coleman. He says of this extract, quote, "This statement is evidence that these Christians kept a day as holy time, but whether it was the last or the first day of the week does not appear." Close quote. Charles Buck, an eminent first-day writer, saw no evidence in this epistle of first-day observance, as is manifest from the indefinite translation which he gives it. Thus he cites the epistle. Quote, "These persons declare that their whole crime, if they are guilty, consists in this, that on certain days they assemble before sunrise to sing alternately the praises of Christ as of God." Close quote. Tertullian, who wrote AD 200, speaks of this very statement of Pliny thus, quote, "He found in their religious services nothing but meeting at early morning for singing hymns to Christ and God, and sealing home their way of life by a united pledge to be faithful to their religion, forbidding murder, adultery, dishonesty, and other crimes." Close quote. Tertullian certainly found in this no reference to the festival of Sunday. Mr. W.B. Taylor speaks of this stated day as follows, quote, "As the Sabbath day appears to have been quite as commonly observed at this date as the sun's day, if not even more so, it is just as probable that this stated day referred to by Pliny was the 7th day as that it was the first day, though the latter is generally taken for granted." Close quote. Taking for granted the very point that should be proved is no new feature in the evidence thus far examined in support of first-day observance. Although Mosheim relies on this expression of Pliny as a chief support of Sunday, yet he speaks thus of the opinion of another learned man. Quote, "B. Justice Henry Boehmer would indeed have us to understand this day to have been the same with the Jewish Sabbath." Close quote. This testimony of Pliny was written a few years subsequent to the time of the Apostles. It relates to a church which probably had been founded by the Apostle Peter. It is certainly far more probable that this church, only 40 years after the death of Peter, was keeping the fourth commandment, than that it was observing a day never enjoined by divine authority. It must be conceded that this testimony from Pliny proves nothing in support of Sunday observance, for it does not designate what day of the week was thus observed. The Epistle of Ignatius of Antioch, so often quoted in behalf of first-day observance, next claim our attention. He is represented as saying, quote, "Wherefore, if they who are brought up in these ancient laws came together in the newness of hope, no longer observing Sabbaths, but keeping the Lord's Day, in which also our life is sprung up by him, and through his death, whom yet some deny, by which mystery we have been brought to believe, and therefore wait that we may be found the disciples of Jesus Christ, our only Master, how shall we be able to live different from him, whose disciples, the very prophets themselves being, did by the Spirit expect him as their Master?" Close quote. Two important facts relative to this quotation are worthy of particular notice. Number one, that the epistles of Ignatius are acknowledged to be spurious by first-day writers of high authority, and those epistles which some of them accept as possibly genuine do not include in their number the epistle to the Magnesians from which the above quotation is made, nor do they say anything relative to first-day observance. Number two, that the epistle to the Magnesians would say nothing of any day were it not that the word day had been fraudulently inserted by the translator. In support of the first of these propositions, the following testimony is adduced. Dr. Killen speaks as follows, quote, "In the 16th century, 15 letters were brought out from beneath the mantle of a hoary antiquity and offered to the world as the productions of the pastor of Antioch. Scholars refused to receive them on the terms required, and forthwith 8 of them were admitted to be forgeries. In the 17th century, the 7 remaining letters, in a somewhat altered form, again came forth from obscurity and claimed to be the works of Ignatius. Again, discerning critics refused to acknowledge their pretensions, but curiosity was roused by this second apparition, and many expressed an earnest desire to obtain a sight of the real epistles. Greece, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were ransacked in search of them, and at length 3 letters are found. The discovery creates general gratulation. It is confessed that 4 of the epistles so lately asserted to be genuine are apocryphal, and it is boldly said that the 3 now forthcoming are above challenge. But truth still refuses to be compromised, and sternly disowns these claimants for her approbation. The internal evidence of these 3 epistles abundantly attests that, like the last 3 books of the Sibyl, they are only the last shifts of a grave impostor." Close quote. The same writer thus states the opinion of Calvin, quote, "It is no mean proof of the sagacity of the great Calvin that upwards of 300 years ago he passed a sweeping sentence of condemnation on these Ignatian epistles." Close quote. Of the 3 epistles of Ignatius still claimed as genuine, Professor C.F. Hudson speaks as follows, quote, "Ignatius of Antioch was martyred probably A.D. 115. Of the 8 epistles ascribed to him, 3 are genuine, such as those addressed to Polycarp, the Ephesians, and the Romans." Close quote. It will be observed that the 3 epistles which are here mentioned as genuine do not include that epistle from which the quotation in behalf of Sunday is taken, and it is a fact also that they contain no allusion to Sunday. Sir William Domville, an anti-Sabbatarian writer, uses the following language, quote, "Every one at all conversant with such matters is aware that the works of Ignatius have been more interpolated and corrupted than those of any other of the ancient fathers, and also that some writings have been attributed to him which are wholly spurious." Close quote. Robinson, an eminent English Baptist writer of the last century, expresses the following opinion of the epistles ascribed to Ignatius, Barnabas, and others. Quote, "If any of the writings attributed to those who are called apostolic fathers, as Ignatius, teacher at Antioch, Polycarp at Smyrna, Barnabas, who was half a Jew, and Hermas, who was brother to Pius, teacher at Rome, if any of these be genuine, of which there is great reason to doubt, they only prove the piety and illiteracy of the good men. Some are worse, and the best not better, than the godly epistles of the lower sort of Baptists and Quakers in the time of the Civil War in England. Barnabas and Hermas both mention baptism, but both of these books are contemptible reveries of wild and irregular geniuses." Close quote. The doubtful character of these Ignatian epistles is thus sufficiently attested. The quotation in behalf of Sunday is not taken from one of the three epistles that are still claimed as genuine. And what is still further to be observed, it would say nothing in behalf of any day were it not for an extraordinary license, not to say fraud, which the translator has used in inserting the word day. This fact is shown with critical accuracy by Kitto, whose cyclopedia is in high repute among first-day scholars. Thus he presents the original of Ignatius with comments and a translation as follows. Quote, "We must here notice one other passage as bearing on the subject of the Lord's Day, though it certainly contains no mention of it. It occurs in the Epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians about AD 100. The whole passage is confessedly obscure, and the text may be corrupt. The passage is as follows," and then Kitto writes out 3 lines in the Greek language. Continuing with Kitto. "Now many commentators assume, on what ground does not appear, that after Lord's the word day is to be understood. Let us now look at the passage simply as it stands. The defect of the sentence is the want of a substantive to which the Greek word autou can refer. This defect, so far from being remedied, is rendered still more glaring by the introduction of the Greek word hemera. Now, if we take Kyriake Zoe as simply the life of the Lord, having a more personal meaning, it certainly goes nearer to supplying the substantive to the Greek word autou. Thus, upon the whole, the meaning might be given thus. If those who lived under the old dispensation have come to the newness of hope, no longer keeping Sabbaths, but living according to our Lord's life, in which, as it were, our life has risen again through him, etc. On this view, the passage does not refer at all to the Lord's day, but even on the opposite supposition, it cannot be regarded as affording any positive evidence to the early use of the term Lord's Day, for which it is often cited, since the material Greek word hemera, day, is purely conjectural." Close quote. The learned Maurer, a clergyman of the Church of England, confirms this statement of Kitto. He renders Ignatius thus, quote, "If therefore they who were well versed in the works of ancient days came to newness of hope, not sabbatizing, but living according to the dominical life, etc., the Medician copy, the best and most like that of Eusebius, leaves no scruple, because the Greek word zoein is expressed and determines the word dominical to the person of Christ, and not to the day of his resurrection." Close quote. Sir William Domville speaks on this point as follows, quote, "Judging therefore by the tenor of the epistle itself, the literal translation of the passage in discussion, no longer observing Sabbaths, but living according to the Lord's life, appears to give its true and proper meaning. And if this be so, Ignatius, whom Mr. Gurney puts forward as a material witness to prove the observance of the Lord's Day in the beginning of the 2nd century, fails to prove any such fact, it appearing on a thorough examination of his testimony that he does not even mention the Lord's Day, nor in any way allude to the religious observance of it, whether by that name or by any other." Close quote. It is manifest, therefore, that this famous quotation has no reference whatever to the first day of the week, and that it furnishes no evidence that that day was known in the time of Ignatius by the title of Lord's Day. The evidence is now before the reader, which must determine whether Mosheim or Neander spoke in accordance with the facts in the case. And thus it appears that in the New Testament, and in the uninspired writers of the period referred to, there is absolutely nothing to sustain the strong Sunday statement of Mosheim. When we come to the 4th century, we shall find a statement by him which essentially modifies what he has here said. Of the epistles ascribed to Barnabas, Pliny, and Ignatius, we have found that the first is a forgery, that the second speaks of a stated day without defining what one, and that the third, which is probably a spurious document, would say nothing relative to Sunday if the advocates of first-day sacredness had not interpolated the word day into the document. We can hardly avoid the conclusion that Mosheim spoke on this subject as a doctor of divinity and not as a historian, and with the firmest conviction that we speak the truth, we say with Neander, quote, "The festival of Sunday was always only a human ordinance." Close quote. Chapter 15. Examination of a famous falsehood. Certain doctors of divinity have made a special effort to show that the stated day of Pliny's epistle is the first day of the week. For this purpose they adduce a fabulous narrative, which the more reliable historians of the Church have not deemed worthy of record. The argument is this, that in Pliny's time and afterward, that is, from the close of the 1st century and onward, whenever the Christians were brought before their persecutors for examination, they were asked whether they had kept the Lord's Day, this term being used to designate the first day of the week. And hence, two facts are asserted to be established. Number one, that when Pliny says that the Christians who were examined by him were accustomed to meet on a stated day, that day was undoubtedly the first day of the week. Number two, that the observance of the first day of the week was the grand test by which Christians were known to their heathen persecutors. Number three, that the Lord's Day was the name by which the first day of the week was known in the time of Pliny, a few years after the death of John. To prove these points, Dr. Edwards makes the following statement, quote, "Hence the fact that their persecutors, when they wished to know whether men were Christians, were accustomed to put to them this question, Dominicum servisti, that is, hast thou kept the Lord's Day? If they had, they were Christians. This was the badge of their Christianity in distinction from Jews and pagans. And if they said they had, and would not recant, they must be put to death. And what, when they continued steadfast, was their answer? Christiana sum, intermitter non passum, that is, I am a Christian, I cannot omit it. It is a badge of my religion, and the man who assumes it must of course keep the Lord's Day, because it is the will of his Lord, and should he abandon it, he would be an apostate from his religion." Close quote. Mr. Gurney, an English first-day writer of some note, uses the same argument, and for the same purpose. The importance attached to this statement and the prominence given to it by the advocates of first-day sacredness render it proper that its merits should be examined. Dr. Edwards gives no authority for his statement, but Mr. Gurney traces the story to Dr. Andrews, Bishop of Winchester, who claimed to have taken it from the Acta Martyrum, an ancient collection of the Acts of the Martyrs. It was in the early part of the 17th century that Bishop Andrews first brought this forward in his speech in the Court of Star Chamber against Thrask, who was accused before that arbitrary tribunal of maintaining the heretical opinion that Christians are bound to keep the seventh day as the Sabbath of the Lord. The story was first produced, therefore, for the purpose of confounding an observer of the Sabbath when on trial by his enemies for keeping that day. Sir William Domville, an able anti-Sabbatarian writer, thus traces out the matter. Quote, "The bishop, as we have seen, refers to the Acta of the Martyrs as justifying his assertion respecting the question Dominicum Servistae. But he does not cite a single instance from them in which that question was put. We are left, therefore, to hunt out the instances for ourselves, wherever, if anywhere, they are to be found. The most complete collection of the memoirs and legends still extant, relative to the lives and sufferings of the Christian martyrs, is that by Ruinart, entitled Acta Primorum Martyrum Sincera et Selecta. I have carefully consulted that work, and I take upon myself to affirm that among the questions there stated to have been put to the martyrs in and before the time of Pliny, and for nearly 200 years afterwards, the question Dominicum Servistae does not once occur, nor any equivalent question." Close quote. This shows at once that no proof can be obtained from this quarter, either that the stated day of Pliny was the first day of the week, of that the martyrs of the early church were tested by the question whether they had observed it or not. It also shows the statement to be false that the martyrs of Pliny's time called Sunday the Lord's Day and kept it as such. After quoting all the questions put to the martyrs in and before Pliny's time, and thus proving that no such question as is alleged was put to them, Domville says, quote, "This much may suffice to show that Dominicum Servistae was no question in Pliny's time, as Mr. Gurney intends us to believe it was. I have, however, still other proof of Mr. Gurney's unfair dealing with the subject, but I defer stating it for the present, that I may proceed in the inquiry. What may have been the authority on which Bishop Andrews relied when stating that Dominicum Servistae was ever a usual question put by the heathen persecutors? I shall with this view pass over the martyrdoms which intervened between Pliny's time and the 4th century, as they contain nothing to the purpose, and shall come at once to that martyrdom the narrative of which was, I have no doubt, the source from which Bishop Andrews derived his question, Dominicum Servistae, hold you the Lord's Day? This martyrdom happened A.D. 304. The sufferers were Saturninus and his 4 sons, and several other persons. They were taken to Carthage and brought before the proconsul Amulinus. In the account given of their examinations by him, the phrases celebrare Dominicum and agere Dominicum frequently occur, but in no instance is the verb servare used in reference to Dominicum. I mention this chiefly to show that when Bishop Andrews, alluding, as no doubt he does, to the narrative of this martyrdom, says the question was Dominicum Servistae, it is very clear he had not his author at hand, and that in trusting to his memory he coined a phrase of his own. Close quote. Domville quotes at length the conversation between the proconsul and the martyrs, which is quite similar in most respects to Gurney's and Edwards' quotation from Andrews. He then adds, quote, "The narrative of the martyrdom of Saturninus being the only one which has the appearance of supporting the assertion of Bishop Andrews that, hold you the Lord's Day, was the usual question to the martyrs, what if I should prove that even this narrative affords no support to that assertion? Yet nothing is more easy than this proof, for Bishop Andrews has quite mistaken the meaning of the word Dominicum in translating it the Lord's Day. It had no such meaning, It was a barbarous word in use among some of the ecclesiastical writers in and subsequent to the 4th century to express sometimes a church and at other times the Lord's Supper, but never the Lord's Day. My authorities on this point are, number 1, Ruinart, who, upon the word Dominicum in the narrative of the martyrdom of Saturninus, has a note in which he says it is a word signifying the Lord's Supper, and he quotes Tertullian and Cyprian in support of this interpretation. Number 2, the editors of the Benedictine edition of St. Augustine's works. They state that the word Dominicum has the two meanings of a church and the Lord's Supper. For the former they quote, among other authorities, a canon of the Council of Neo-Caesarea. For the latter meaning they quote Cyprian, and refer also to St. Augustine's account of his conference with the Donatists, in which allusion is made to the narrative of the martyrdom of Saturninus. Number 3, Gesner, who, in his Latin Thesaurus, published in 1749, gives both meanings to the word Dominicum. For that of the Lord's Supper he quotes Cyprian. For that of the Church he quotes Cyprian and also Hilary. Close quote. Domville states other facts of interest bearing on this point, and then pays his respects to Mr. Gurney as follows. Quote, "It thus appearing that the reference made by Bishop Andrews to the Acts of the Martyrs completely fails to establish his dictum respecting the question alleged to have been put to the martyrs, and it also appearing that there existed strong and obvious reasons for not placing implicit reliance upon that dictum, what are we to think of Mr. Gurney's regard for truth, when we find he does not scruple to tell his readers that the stated day mentioned in Pliny's letter as that on which the Christian held their religious assemblies was clearly the first day of the week, is proved by the very question which it was customary for the Roman persecutors to address to the martyrs, Dominicum servisti, hast thou kept the Lord's Day? For this unqualified assertion, prefixed as it is by the word clearly, in order to make it the more impressive, Mr. Gurney is without any excuse." Close quote. The justice of Domville's language cannot be questioned when he characterizes this favorite first-day argument as, quote, "one of those daring misstatements of facts so frequent in theological writings, and which, from the confident tone so generally assumed by the writers on such occasions, are usually received without examination, and allowed in consequence to pass current for truth." Close quote. The investigation to which this statement has been subjected shows, number 1, that no such question as, "Hast thou kept the Lord's Day?" is upon record as proposed to the martyrs in the time of Pliny. Number 2, that no such question was asked to any martyr prior to the commencement of the 4th century. Number 3, that a single instance of martyrdom in which any question of the kind was asked is all that can be claimed. Number 4, that in this one case, which is all that has even the slightest appearance of sustaining the story under examination, a correct translation of the original Latin shows that the question had no relation whatever to the observance of Sunday. All this has been upon the assumption that the Acta Martyrum, in which this story is found, is an authentic work. Let Mosheim testify relative to the character of this work for veracity. Quote, "As to those accounts which have come down to us under the title of Acta Martyrum, or the Acts of the Martyrs, their authority is certainly for the most part of a very questionable nature. Indeed, speaking generally, it might be coming nearer to the truth, perhaps, were we to say that they are entitled to no sort of credit whatever." Close quote. Such is the authority of the work from which this story is taken. It is not strange that first-day historians should leave the repetition of it to theologians. Such are the facts respecting this extraordinary falsehood. They constitute so complete an exposure of this famous historical argument for Sunday as to consign it to the just contempt of all honest men. But this is too valuable an argument to be lightly surrendered, and moreover it is as truthful as are certain other of the historical arguments for Sunday. It will not do to give up this argument because of its dishonesty, for others will have to go with it for possessing the same character. Since the publication of Domville's elaborate work, James Gilfillan of Scotland has written a large volume entitled The Sabbath, which has been extensively circulated both in Europe and in America, and is esteemed a standard work by the American Tract Society and by first-day denominations in general. Gilfillan had read Domville as appears from his statements on pages 10, 142, 143, 616 of his volume. He was therefore acquainted with Domville's exposure of the fraud respecting Dominicum Servestae, but though he was acquainted with this exposure, he offers not one word in reply. On the contrary, he repeats the story with as much assurance as though it had not been proved a falsehood. But as Domville had shown up the matter from the Acta Martyrum, it was necessary for Gilfillan to trace it to some other authority, and so he assigns it to Cardinal Baronius. Here are Gilfillan's words, quote, "From the days of the apostles downwards for many years, the followers of Christ had no enemies more fierce and unrelenting than that people, the Jews, who cursed them in the synagogue, sent out emissaries into all countries to calumniate their master and them, and were abettors wherever they could of the martyrdom of men such as Polycarp, of whom the world was not worthy. Among the reasons of this deadly enmity was the change of the Sabbatic day. The Romans, though they had no objection on this score, punished the Christians for the faithful observance of their day of rest, one of the testing questions put to the martyrs being, Dominicum Servestae, have you kept the Lord's day? Close quote. Gilfillan, having reproduced this statement and assigned as his authority the annalist Baronius, more recent first-day writers take courage and repeat the story after him. Now they are all right as they think. What if the Acta Martyrum has failed them? Domville ought to have gone to Baronius, who, in their judgment, is the true source of information in this matter. Had he done this, they say, he would have been saved from misleading his readers. But let us ascertain what evil Domville has done in this case. It all consists in the assertion of two things out of the Acta Martyrum. Number one, that no such question as Dominicum Servestae was addressed to any martyr till the early part of the 4th century, some 200 years after the time of Pliny. Number two, that the question even then did not relate to what is called the Lord's Day, but to the Lord's Supper. Now it is a remarkable fact that Gilfillan has virtually admitted the truth of the first of these statements, for the earliest instance which he could find in Baronius is A.D. 303, as his reference plainly shows. It differs only 1 year from the date assigned in Ruinart's Acta Martyrum, and relates to the very case which Domville has quoted from that work. Domville's first and most important statement is therefore vindicated by Gilfillan himself, though he has not the frankness to say this in so many words. Domville's second point is that Dominicum, when used as a noun, as in the present case, signifies either a church or the Lord's Supper, but never signifies Lord's Day. He establishes the fact by incontestable evidence. Gilfillan was acquainted with all this. He could not answer Domville, and yet he was not willing to abandon the falsehood which Domville had exposed. So he turns from the Acta Martyrum, in which the compiler expressly defines the word to mean precisely what Domville asserts, and brings forward the great Romish annalist, Cardinal Baronius. Now, say our first-day friends, we are to have the truth from a high authority. Gilfillan has found in Baronius an express statement that the martyrs were tested by the question, have you kept the Lord's Day? No matter then as to the acta martyrum from which Bishop Andrews first produced this story. That, indeed, has failed us, but we have in its stead the weighty testimony of the great Baronius. To be sure, he fixes this test no earlier than the 4th century, which renders it of no avail as proof that Pliny's stated day was Sunday. But it is worth much to have Baronius bear witness that certain martyrs in the 4th century were put to death because they observed the Sunday Lord's Day. But these exultant thoughts are vain. I must state a grave fact in plain language. Gilfillan has deliberately falsified the testimony of Baronius. That historian records at length the martyrdom of Saturninus and his company in northern Africa in A.D. 303. It is the very story which Domville has cited from the Acta Martyrum, and Baronius repeatedly indicates that he himself copied it from that work. He gives the various questions propounded by the proconsul and the several answers which were returned by each of the martyrs. I copy from Baronius the most important of these. They were arrested while they were celebrating the Lord's Sacrament according to custom. The following is the charge on which they were arrested. They had celebrated the Collectum Dominicum against the command of the emperors. The proconsul asked the first whether he had celebrated the Collectum, and he replied that he was a Christian and had done this. Another says, quote, I have not only been in the Collecta, but I have celebrated the Dominicum with the brethren because I am a Christian. Close quote. Another says, we have celebrated the Dominicum because the Dominicum cannot be neglected. Another said that the Collecta was made or observed at his house. The proconsul, questioning again one of those already examined, received this answer, quote, the Dominicum cannot be disregarded. The law so commands. Close quote. When one was asked whether the Collecta was made or observed at his house, he answered, quote, in my house we have celebrated the Dominicum. Close quote. He added, quote, without the Dominicum we cannot be, close quote, or live. To another, the proconsul said that he did not wish to know whether he was a Christian, but whether he participated in the Collecta. His reply was, quote, as if one could be a Christian without the Dominicum, or as if the Dominicum can be celebrated without the Christian, close quote. And he said further to the proconsul, quote, we have observed the Collecta most sacredly. We have always convened in the Dominicum for reading the Lord's Word, close quote. Another said, quote, I have been in, literally have made, the Collecta with my brethren. I have celebrated the Dominicum, close quote. After him, another proclaimed the Dominicum to be the hope and safety of the Christian, and when tortured as the others, he exclaimed, quote, I have celebrated the Dominicum with a devoted heart, and with my brethren I have made the Collecta because I am a Christian, close quote. When the proconsul again asked one of these whether he had conducted the Dominicum, he replied that he had because Christ was his Savior. I have thus given the substance of this famous examination, and have set before the reader the references therein made to the Dominicum. It is to be observed that Collecta is used as another name for Dominicum. Now, does Baronius use either of these words to signify Lord's Day? It so happens that he has defined these words with direct reference to this very case no less than 7 times. Now let us read these 7 definitions. When Baronius records the first question addressed to these martyrs, he there defines these words as follows, quote, by the words collectum, collectionem, and Dominicum, the author always understands the sacrifice of the Mass, close quote. After recording the words of that martyr who had said that the law commanded the observance of the Dominicum, Baronius defines his statement thus, quote, Evidently, the Christian law concerning the Dominicum no doubt about celebrating the sacrifice." Close quote. Baronius, by the Romish words sacrifice and Mass, refers to the celebration of the Lord's Supper by these martyrs. At the conclusion of the examination, he again defines the celebration of the Dominicum. He says, quote, "It has been shown above in relating these things that the Christians were moved, even in the time of severe persecution, to celebrate the Dominicum. Evidently, as we have declared elsewhere in many places, it was a sacrifice without bloodshed and of divine appointment." Close quote. He presently defines Dominicum again, saying, quote, "Though it is a fact that the same expression was employed at times with reference to the temple of God, yet since all the churches upon the earth have united in this matter, and from other things related above, it has been sufficiently shown concerning the celebration of the Dominicum that only the sacrifice of the Mass can be understood." Close quote. Observe this last statement. He says, though the word has been employed to designate the temple of the Lord, yet in the things here related it can only signify the sacrifice of the Mass. These testimonies are exceedingly explicit. But Baronius has not yet finished. In the index to Tome 3, he explains these words again with direct reference to this very martyrdom. Thus, under collecta is this statement, quote, "The collecta, the Dominicum, the Mass, the same." Close quote. Under missa, quote, "The Mass is the same as the collecta or Dominicum." Close quote. Under Dominicum, quote, "To celebrate the Dominicum is the same as to conduct the Mass." Close quote. All statements made AD 303. It is not possible to mistake the meaning of Baronius. He says that Dominicum signifies the Mass. The celebration of the supper by these martyrs was doubtless very different from the pompous ceremony which the Church of Rome now observes under the name of Mass. But it was the sacrament of the Lord's Supper concerning which they were tested, and for observing which they were put to a cruel death. The word Dominicum signifies, quote, "the sacred mysteries," close quote, as Ruinart defines it. And Baronius, in 7 times affirming this definition, though acknowledging that it has sometimes been used to signify temple of God, plainly declares that in this record it can have no other meaning than that service which the Romanists call the sacrifice of the Mass. Gilfillan had read all this, yet he dares to quote Baronius as saying that these martyrs were tested by the question, "Have you kept the Lord's Day?" He could not but know that he was writing a direct falsehood, but he thought the honor of God and the advancement of the cause of truth demanded this act at his hands. Before Gilfillan wrote his work, Domville had called attention to the fact that the sentence Dominicum Servistae does not occur in the acta martyrum, a different verb being used every time. But this is the popular form of this question and must not be given up. So Gilfillan declares that Baronius uses it in his record of the martyrdoms in AD 303. But we have cited the different forms of question recorded by Baronius and find them to be precisely the same with those of the acta martyrum. Dominicum Servistae does not occur in that historian, and Gilfillan, in stating that it does, is guilty of untruth. This, however, is comparatively unimportant. But for asserting that Baronius speaks of Lord's Day under the name of Dominicum, Gilfillan stands convicted of inexcusable falsehood in matters of serious importance.